I returned from a 6-month business trip abroad and discovered that my 3-year-old son was not at home. My mother told me, it's time for him to live with his real family. My sister, who cannot have children, had already planned to change his surname in the documents. I didn't scream but took action. My mother and sister turned pale. I came back from a 6-month work assignment overseas, opened the front door and immediately knew something was wrong. My son wasn't there. The house was spotless. Too spotless. No juice cups left on the coffee table. No toys scattered on the carpet. No soft blanket draped across the couch where he always curled up with his cartoons. The place felt staged. Empty. Not lived in. I called out his name once. Nothing. I walked straight to his bedroom. The sheets were folded. His favorite stuffed fox wasn't on the bed. The closet was nearly empty. I opened every drawer. His clothes, gone. His shoes, gone. His books, his puzzles, the nightlight shaped like a rocket, gone. I called Maria, the nanny I'd hired before I left. She'd worked for me for over a year. She'd promised to take care of him like her own. We'd done video chats. She sent weekly updates. Photos. Everything had seemed fine. No answer. I called again. Voicemail. I messaged her. Nothing. My stomach dropped. I hadn't even unpacked. I walked back out the door and drove straight to my mother's house. It wasn't a question in my mind, it was a certainty. If something had happened, she would have told me. If something hadn't, then I already knew what she was capable of. She opened the door like she'd been waiting. No surprise on her face. Just this cold, distant look. He's with real family now. That's all she said. I walked right past her. My heart was beating so fast it hurt. I found my sister sitting at the kitchen table with her husband, sorting through paperwork. Legal forms. Court documents. One page in particular caught my eye. It had my son's name at the top, followed by a different surname. Her surname. I stood over them, trying to understand what I was looking at. My sister looked up at me and said she'd already started the process. She said she'd spoken to a lawyer. That her name was going on the birth certificate. That she and her husband had been preparing to adopt for years. That this was easier. That this was natural. Then she told me my son was calling her mommy. My legs almost gave out. My mother stood behind me like some bodyguard, like she was keeping me from making a scene in her perfect house. She said I'd made my choice. That 6 months was abandonment. That I chose work over motherhood. That my son had been happier these past few months than he'd ever been with me. They'd taken him. Manipulated Maria into leaving. Hid everything from me. Had the audacity to think I'd hand him over just because I was working to support him. They saw my sacrifice as a weakness. But I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just walked out. I drove to a parking lot and sat there for over an hour without moving. Just thinking. Just letting it all sink in. They'd taken my son. They'd built an entire plan while I was gone. They thought I was helpless. But I wasn't. I had more connections than they realized. I had money. I had documentation. And I had every single message, photo and timestamp from Maria confirming she'd been working and updating me the entire time. I had legal standing. They thought I'd panic. They thought I'd give up. They had no idea what I was about to do. I didn't go home that night. I booked a hotel room across town under a different name and stayed up until sunrise. Not crying. Planning. The first thing I did was back up everything. Every message between me and Maria. Every email. The videos she'd sent of him brushing his teeth, eating breakfast, falling asleep with that fox in his arms. I backed up bank statements showing I was paying her consistently. I printed records of every video call I had with my son. I gathered everything I could think of. At 7:58 a.m. I called an attorney I knew from a corporate compliance case 2 years back. I told him everything. He listened silently for 10 minutes, then said 3 words. Parental rights violation. We had to move fast. The longer they kept him, the more they could claim emotional attachment, stability, routine. Courts cared about things like that. Appearances. But I wasn't worried about appearances. I had something they didn't. Proof. By the end of the day, my lawyer filed an emergency custody petition and a formal accusation of unlawful detainment of a minor. Not abduction, not yet. But we had enough to start the process. He also submitted a request to subpoena Maria. It took us 3 days to find her. She was in Nevada. My mother and sister had paid her off. gave her cash and told her to disappear, promised she wouldn't get in trouble. She'd signed a non-disclosure agreement my sister's husband had drawn up. Probably thought that made her untouchable. He was wrong. Once she realized how serious things had gotten, she started talking. Told us everything. How my mother showed up at the house saying I'd given permission for the child to stay with family. How they told her I had changed my mind and didn't want to come back. How they said my son was better off, that she was just temporary. Maria handed over her phone voluntarily. My mother had messaged her pretending to be me. The name on the contact was mine, but the number wasn't. They'd used a burner phone. I had no idea how long they'd been planning it, but it wasn't impulsive. We now had impersonation. Fraud. A digital trail. It was better than I expected. The next step was filing for a temporary restraining order. We filed it against both my mother and my sister. Once it was approved, we'd serve them at the same time. They wouldn't be allowed near my son. But none of this meant anything unless I knew where he was. And they weren't keeping him at their house anymore. That became clear when I drove by that night and saw no toys in the yard, no car seat in the back of their SUV. The lights were off by 8 p.m. They were hiding him. I went back to my hotel and did something I never thought I'd do. I called my ex-husband. He didn't even know I'd left the country. Hadn't spoken to our son since the divorce. Didn't ask about him. Didn't care. But he hated my sister. She'd once outed one of his affairs to me by accident, trying to score points. I asked if she'd contacted him. She had. 2 weeks ago. Asking about reinstating his paternal rights. That was the phrase she used. She told him I was unstable. That I was probably going to leave the country again. That my son deserved a chance at a normal family. They were trying to set up a case for full custody, between her and her husband, by building the narrative that I was an absent, unfit mother. And if they could get my ex involved as a witness against me, even better. But she underestimated him too. He offered to help. Not because he cared about me or even our son, but because he hated being used. He told me something that made my stomach turn. They'd taken my son to a house outside city limits. Belonged to my sister's husband's cousin. No kids in the area. No neighbors close enough to notice anything strange. They were keeping him there until the name change went through. Until he forgot. I called my lawyer at midnight. Told him where the boy was. He said to sit tight. The next morning, the court granted the restraining order. That same afternoon, we sent law enforcement to retrieve my son. I didn't go with them. I wasn't allowed to. But I waited. 1 hour. 2. 3. At 6:41 p.m. I got the call. They had him. He was safe. But he didn't ask for me. He asked for her. And that's when I realized. This wasn't over. Not even close. I thought getting him back would be the hardest part. I was wrong. The officer who brought him to the Child Services Center said he'd been quiet the entire drive. Clutching that same stuffed fox. Eyes wide, not crying, just silent. Like he wasn't sure what was happening. They told me to wait in a small room with plain chairs and a cheap plastic table. A social worker stayed with me, probably to observe the interaction. When they brought him in, he stood in the doorway and looked at me like I was a stranger. He didn't run to me. He didn't say my name. He didn't smile. He just stared. The last time I held him, he was clinging to my neck, saying he didn't want me to leave. Now he stood 5 feet away, unsure if he was even allowed to come closer. I bent down and asked if he remembered me. He nodded slowly. I opened my arms. He didn't move. It took 10 full minutes for him to walk over. And even then it was cautious. Like he thought he'd get in trouble. I hugged him, but he didn't hug back. He sat stiff in the chair next to me, staring at the fox in his hands. The social worker gently said it would take time. That kids adapt, but they also absorb more than we realize. That my son had been told I left. That I didn't want him. That his new mommy loved him more. I left the center numb. With legal custody restored, I took him home. Not the old house. I'd already packed up most of it and moved into a different apartment in another part of the city. Fresh start. Neutral ground. I didn't want any ghosts in the walls. The first night he didn't speak. The second he asked when he was going back. I didn't show anything on my face, but inside I was cracking. They'd gotten into his head more than I thought. He kept asking if Auntie would visit. If Grandma was mad at him. He didn't understand why he wasn't allowed to talk to them. I had to sit down and tell him the truth, age-appropriate but still honest. That some people say untrue things when they want something really badly. That he was never forgotten. That I never stopped loving him. That the nanny had taken good care of him until other people made choices they weren't supposed to. It was the first time he looked directly at me. The first time something seemed to click. Still, it wasn't like flipping a switch. He clung to routine, asking for shows he used to watch at their house, foods I'd never made for him. He had trouble sleeping. Woke up crying once, saying he thought he'd be taken again. Meanwhile, my lawyer pushed forward. The court date was set for 2 weeks later. It would no longer be just about custody, it was a full civil suit now. Fraud, impersonation, unlawful detainment of a minor, emotional harm. We had Maria's testimony. Her signed affidavit. The burner phone evidence. Screenshots of the forged messages. But none of it gave me the satisfaction I thought it would. Because as I was building the case, I realized something chilling. They'd gotten further than anyone should have been able to. My sister had almost replaced me in my son's life, and for weeks it had worked. And if I hadn't come back when I did, if I'd extended my trip by another month, maybe even another week, he might have believed I never existed. They weren't just trying to take him. They were trying to erase me. And I wasn't sure the court was enough anymore. I wanted them to feel what they'd made him feel. Confused. Alone. Abandoned. I started thinking about what else I could do. Not out of revenge. Out of survival. Because something told me they weren't finished either. The court date was looming, and while I was prepping documents and practicing statements with my lawyer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. The pieces didn't fully add up. They had planned it too well. There had to be more. And I was right. I went through my sister's social media. She hadn't posted anything about him. Not one photo, not even a hint. But I noticed she'd been tagged in an old photo, one I hadn't seen before. It was from a month earlier. She was smiling with her husband at a backyard party, and in the background, barely visible, was my son. No one had told me about that party. I reverse searched the image, traced the tag to one of her husband's cousins, then found a string of posts from a private profile that hadn't been locked properly. And there was more photos. My son playing with other kids. Holding a balloon. A little cake with his name on it, only it wasn't his real last name. They were already using the one she tried to change it to. And in one photo I saw someone that made my chest go cold. My former boss. He'd retired a year before I left for Europe. He wasn't family. He wasn't even close to my sister as far as I knew. But he was in the background, smiling, a glass in his hand like he belonged there. I called him. Pretended I just wanted to catch up. 5 minutes in, I mentioned the photo. There was a pause. Then he said something about how proud he was that I'd finally given my son a better life. My throat went dry. He thought I'd given them permission. I asked what he meant. He told me my sister said I was stepping away, that I'd gone to Europe for good and wanted to transition motherhood gradually to her. That I was too emotionally overwhelmed to say goodbye, so she was handling things quietly. He said she used that exact word. Transition. Like this was some business deal. I hung up and stared at my wall for a long time. She told everyone. Family, friends, even people I'd worked with, that I'd chosen to give him up. That I didn't want to come back. That I was done being his mother. And they believed her. Because she made it easy to believe. She was the one with the nice house. The stable marriage. The perfect image. Me. The divorced mother who traveled for work and didn't lean on family. The one who left. The more I looked, the more lies I found. They'd created an entire narrative. One of my mother's friends even emailed me a few weeks before I came back. Just one of those vague check-ins I hadn't paid attention to at the time. But now I read it again and I realized she was trying to say goodbye. They were saying goodbye. To me. I printed everything. Every photo, message, timestamp, name. Every lie they'd told. Every person they'd manipulated into helping them erase me. The day of the hearing, I walked into that courtroom with a binder so thick the judge raised an eyebrow. My lawyer gave me a look like he didn't even know what I'd found, and truthfully, I hadn't told him everything. Not yet. My mother and sister were already seated. Dressed like they were attending a church brunch. My sister's husband even smiled at me like we were just settling some mild family misunderstanding. They still didn't get it. They still thought this was about getting him back. But I already had him. Now it was about making sure they'd never get near him again. And what I revealed in court wasn't just about lies. It was about something they never expected me to find. something they thought they'd hidden. And when I pulled out the final set of documents, handed them to my lawyer and watched him place them into evidence, I finally saw them panic. Because they knew exactly what I'd discovered. And they knew it could destroy them. The moment the clerk stamped those final documents into the record, the energy in the courtroom changed. My mother's posture shifted. My sister's confident expression cracked for the first time. She glanced at her husband, who stopped smiling. They knew what I'd brought. But no one else did. Not yet. My lawyer stood up and explained to the judge what we were submitting. Financial records, dating back nearly a year. Some were mine, showing consistent payments to Maria, the nanny. Others weren't mine. They were bank transfers. To Maria. From an account under my sister's husband's name. 6 months ago, right before I left the country. The timing wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a rescue mission, some noble act of concern like they tried to paint it. This had been orchestrated, funded, and executed like a business deal. He paid Maria off while I was still packing my bags for Europe. Paid her more than I ever had. She took the money, left quietly, and never contacted me again. They didn't just take advantage of a bad situation. They created it. The judge asked them directly if they had paid the nanny. My sister said she didn't remember. My mother said she wasn't involved in financial matters. My sister's husband just stared ahead like he hadn't heard the question. So I handed the judge something else. A signed affidavit from Maria. And a video. She'd recorded herself confessing, probably out of guilt or fear of being dragged into something criminal. She said they told her I had broken down, that I was emotionally unstable and couldn't return. They offered her a generous payout and a plane ticket if she agreed to disappear quietly and never answer my calls again. The courtroom was dead silent. And then came the real damage. The documents I hadn't even told my lawyer about yet. The ones I found 2 nights before the hearing, digging through a forgotten email account I hadn't touched in years. I found a thread between my sister and a woman from an adoption agency. Not an official agency. One of those shady family matching consultants people used to bypass legal waitlists. My sister had written to her 2 months before I even accepted the job in Germany. The email's subject line was, Plan B, if Olivia says no. She was already looking to take my son long before I ever boarded that plane. She hadn't just taken advantage of the situation. She was waiting for it, planning it, hoping for it. The judge read that email out loud. My mother tried to interrupt. She was told to sit down. My sister's face went white. My lawyer didn't need to say anything after that. The hearing ended faster than I expected. Not only did the court reaffirm my full custody, they extended the restraining order for 5 years, barring both my mother and my sister from any contact. Not even through third parties. My sister's husband tried to speak on her behalf. The judge cut him off. We left the courtroom and no one followed me. No one called out. No one tried to apologize. But that didn't mean it was over. Because the last file in my binder wasn't for the court. It was for the IRS. I had proof of the under-the-table payments. Unreported income. Wire transfers. Fraudulent use of a legal alias in a custody application. I sent it the next morning. Anonymously. They had tried to erase me from my son's life. Now I was erasing myself from theirs. But not quietly. My son was back home. He was beginning to smile again. Sleep through the night. Say my name without hesitation. But the damage was done. He'd lost trust in people he thought he could depend on. I didn't know how long it would take to fix that. Maybe years. But I would be there. Every step of the way. They took something from him that they can never give back. So now I'm taking something from them. And I'm not finished yet. 2 weeks after the hearing, my sister lost her job. She worked in healthcare, public-facing, a job that required clean ethics. Apparently someone from the licensing board received an anonymous tip about her attempt to falsify guardianship papers and impersonate a legal guardian for a minor. They opened a review. Her employer placed her on leave, then quietly let her go. A few days after that, I heard through someone from our old church group that my mother had been removed from the local community board she'd been part of for years. It wasn't a scandal, more like quiet shame. People had seen the court records. The email leaks. Some of them had backed her when she said I abandoned my child. They felt humiliated. One of her closest friends called me. She apologized. Said she believed my mother because she sounded believable. She told people I was chasing status in Europe, while my child needed me. He said I was unstable. That I wouldn't be coming back. That it was for the best. When I told her my son still woke up some nights asking if he'd be taken again, the line went quiet. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I just wanted them to feel it. The consequence. The aftermath. And it was just beginning. The IRS started auditing my sister's husband's business accounts. I never got confirmation that it was because of what I sent. But the timing was perfect. Apparently, those under-the-table nanny payments weren't the only thing that hadn't been reported. By mid-month they put their house up for sale. I didn't watch from the sidelines. Kept going. Therapy for my son. Therapy for me. Legal arrangements to move out of the state permanently. We changed his last name, not to mine but to something new. A clean slate. Something only the two of us shared. Something no one could take again. I filed paperwork to make sure no one in my family could access his school records, medical history, or address without a court order. It was tight. Bulletproof. And still I wasn't angry. I wasn't even bitter. I was just awake now. For years I'd told myself my family was complicated, not dangerous. That they were overbearing, not manipulative. That their guilt trips and backhanded help came from love. That they meant well even when they ignored my boundaries. That lie was over. They had planned the erasure of my motherhood and smiled in my face while doing it. And for what? Because my sister couldn't have children? Because my mother wanted to play savior? Because they couldn't stand the idea that I could survive without needing them? None of that mattered anymore. They didn't win. They didn't even come close. But the scariest part? If I'd come back even a week later they might have. I look at my son now, laughing in the bathtub, drawing rockets and dragons, sleeping with that old stuffed fox. And I realize just how close they came to making me a ghost in my own child's memory. Not again. Not ever. They thought they could rewrite the story. But I'm the one holding the pen now. And this story is ours.